Mark your books at number 32 be the song after the lesson. Number 32. Once you got that mark, turn to number 427. 427. I love the Lord, for He died my soul to save. On Calvary, dear life He freely gave. From realms above, Jesus freely came to die, that I might live someday with Him on high. I love the Lord, He has been so good to me. He gave His life from sin to set me free. No greater love than His could ever be. I love the Lord because He first loved me. I love the Lord for His love so full and free. He taught us why that our love like His should be. To be like Him, that compassion freely give. Oh, bless His name, with Him could live. I love the Lord, He has been so good to me. He gave His life from sin to set me free. No greater love than His could ever be. I love the Lord because He first loved me.
Bow with me as we pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank You for this day and its many blessings. We thank You for this time that we have to gather together to study a portion of Your word. We ask You to be with us and help us to be attentive to the things that are being taught. Be with those teachers of the hours. Give them a good recollection of the materials that they've prepared. We thank You so much for Your Son who came and died on the cross for our sins. We ask You to be with those that's been mentioned that's been sick. Comfort them and heal them as only the way that You can. Be with those, Heavenly Father, that have lost loved ones. Comfort and strengthen them. We thank You, Heavenly Father, for this country that we live in, for all the many blessings that we have, Heavenly Father. We thank You for our congregation here. Be with us and help us to be a bright, shining light, not only to our community here, Heavenly Father, but as we reach out into this whole world. We ask You to be with us with this singing we have upcoming. Help us to shine our light throughout the community and lift each other up in songs of praise. Once again, Heavenly Father, we thank You so much for Your Son, and we ask these favors and blessings in His name. Amen.
Have you ever done something that you knew was wrong, but your friends did it so you thought it was okay? Today I'm going to talk to you about peer pressure and how you can lean on God to overcome these things. Proverbs 13:20 says, "Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, and the companions of fools will suffer harm." In this verse, David tells the people that if they become like the wise and they put themselves around wise people, then they will be like the wise. But he also says that if they put themselves around fools, that they will suffer from the same harm that they do throughout eternity. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with temptation, he will also provide a way of escape so that you may be able to endure it." In this, Paul says to the church at Corinth that God will help them to not be tempted and is always there to provide a way of escape. The last verse I would like to talk to you about is Proverbs 4:14 through 15. It says, "Do not turn to the path of evil and wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Turn away from it and pass on." In this, David is telling the people that they need to avoid the path of wickedness and not walk in the ways of evil. He also says to not associate with it. We all have some point in life dwelt in the path of evil, and if you are in need of forgiveness or have already been forgiven but have fallen away, come forward as we stand and sing.
Hear the blessed Savior calling me your rest. Oh, ye heavy laden, come to me and rest. Come and walk your tarry, I will go away. Bring me every burden, bring me every care. Come unto me. I will give you rest. Will you not obey him? Come to Jesus now. Yes, love your things you save you by his side. Come today to Jesus, he will wait on you. There is tender pleading, he is calling you. Come unto me. I will give you rest.
Well, good evening. We're in James chapter 5. James chapter 5. That means we are coming to the very close end to our study on the book of James. In total, we'll encompass about 13 weeks of our study. After tonight, we'll only have 2 more Wednesday night sessions of this class. and then we will start a study on the book of Colossians, and Colossians will have homework. Don't panic, it won't be bad. Each night you'll get 5 questions, or 5 true and false, or 5 kind of division up questions that will have to do with everything that we do in the class as we go over that night, and that will go through the entirety. And sometimes as we go through that class, we might ask you to turn those back in, because there's several discussion segments we want to have in the book of Colossians. But for the next 2 weeks after tonight, we'll be in the book of James, and then we'll, of course, do an introductory period in the book of Colossians. There won't be homework that night unless you just really are itching for it, and I can certainly do what you want to do. But we'll start that class up 2 weeks after tonight. But for now, we're in James chapter 5, and we're entering our segment tonight as we start talking about our class, as we go through talking about concerns for rich oppressors. Now, I want to start off with a question tonight, and I want you to be honest, not that you wouldn't be, but I want you to be honest about this question. Do you think you're rich? I guess it depends on how we ask that question, right? Let's ask it in 2 different ways. Number 1, spiritually, are you rich? And the answer is yes, because we learn about Jesus. We learn about what Jesus has provided for mankind. We are given all spiritual blessings in heavenly places or from heavenly places inside of Christ Jesus. So tonight, as Christians, we are very rich, aren't we, in that aspect? Think about the second way. Let's think about this physically for just a moment. Tonight, physically speaking, are you rich? Now, notice I didn't ask you if you are ultra rich. We'll talk about the ultra rich here in just a moment. But are you rich tonight? Well, here's something that's true. Every person that I see in this room has clothes on their backs. Every person in this room came from a household or a family, so you have a place to live. I look at all the people in this room and I know something about us. Don't take this wrong, okay? Some of you are already smiling. I know we didn't miss a meal today, okay? Don't take that wrong, but I know you've ate today. You and I are blessed, aren't we? We're blessed in many ways, but think about the country we live in. Financially, we are blessed. In infrastructure, we are blessed. In all sorts of different ways of opportunities and expectations, we are blessed. We are rich. So starting off tonight, I want you to know that spiritually you are rich. Spiritually you are rich. Physically you're rich as well. And we're going to keep those 2 ideas in our mind as we go through this class, because as he starts out this segment, he's going to start talking about rich oppressors. And you start off in James chapter 5, verse 1, and you read this phrase, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you." Now, many times when you and I read this, we see this word rich. And we might in our minds equate the word rich when we see it, or riches, to those who are what I would call ultra rich. Do you know who the world's, I'm going to phrase that question right, do you know who the individual in the world that has the most money? You know what his name is? At least in the United States. All right? He was one of those men. I heard someone say something over here. Elon Musk. Let me ask you a question. Would you ever thought that Raynelda Bohannon would know Elon Musk's name? She does. She's the only one this morning at 10 o'clock that got that question. I mean, instantly. Rich. When we think about riches, that's what we think about. Someone that has the ability, the funds, the withal in his mind to be able to buy entire corporations. Someone that can start companies like Tesla or SpaceX, sending people into outer space. And we think about all the riches that he has, and that's what we usually think about when it comes to rich, the ultra rich or the famous in our world. We think about celebrities or athletes that have accumulated great wealth. And many times that's what we think about. And probably in James 5:1, as it was read for the first time, that's probably what they thought about. So for just a moment, let's tint our discussion that way. He says, "Come now, you rich." What did they probably do? He's not talking about me. I'm not the ultra rich. He's going to tell someone else. He says, "Weep and howl." Now, we know what it means to weep, but what does it mean to howl? Anybody want to give us a howl tonight? What does it mean to howl? verbally expressing some great lamentation here, crying aloud in misery, because he tells us what's happening. There's miseries, and he said these miseries are coming specifically upon you. So as he starts this chapter, which I believe has a great connection to chapter 4, he says, you that are rich, you need to weep, you need to howl, because something is coming upon you. Something in your life is getting ready to come to you, and you're going to face it. Now, have there ever been people inside of history who were, just like you and I, we're going to change our thoughts for just a minute, who had what they needed, who had more than what they needed, but did not allow the conversation of religion to affect their lives? Can you think of anyone like that? Think about the New Testament. I'll give you a hint. It's in your handout. Not by word. Someone read for us Acts 24:25. Someone read for us out loud Acts 24:25. We're going to find a man who had everything in this life. We would call him rich. And when the gospel message was presented to him, he says something. Someone read Acts 24:25. Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, what will I do? Then I'll call you back. There's something I want you to see as we start off, because he's having this mentality and he's bringing it to the forefront of our minds. There are those in this life who have everything that they need, everything that they desire, everything that they want, and they're 0-bit concerned about God. Now, I want to ask you a question tonight. Could that be us? I didn't say should it be, because it shouldn't be, but can that be us? Can we allow the chasing of riches, the chasing of influence, the chasing of living like this world to distract us from living as who we should? The answer is yes. Remember how we stated verse 1, when they read this, they probably, like you and I, I'm not the ultra rich. This isn't talking about me. Hold that thought for just a minute. He says something's coming upon you. He says your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. You ever had a moth or some type of insect destroy your garments? Eat a little hole in your shirt. Maybe that suit that you had hanging in the closet for a little bit too long. Eat a hole in those pants or in that suit jacket. Here's something that you and I need to see as we start this segment. He's going to talk about garments. He's going to talk about riches. And with riches, he's going to use this phrase, your riches are corrupted. And with your garments, he's going to use this phrase, your garments are moth-eaten. Now, interesting enough, when you think about the riches here, the wealth, the prosperity, all the things that they had, and you look at this word corrupted, if you look at it in its Greek structure, it literally means your riches are rotten in your life. Here's why I say that, because here's a question. Is money evil? Is gold and silver evil? Can gold and silver, can money be used for good? Yes. Can it be used for evil? Just as equally, yes, as it could be. Money is not the problem. Tonight, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about your attitude and mine. And James was writing about their attitude and his, and he's just come off a segment, the ending of chapter 4, about going to buy and sell and trade and make gain. And do you remember what the number one problem they had in the end of chapter 4 was? Who did they forget? They forgot God. The end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5 are linked together in a unique way, because he doubles down in two different ways to tell us you cannot forget God. But here he does it in a reverse way. He says when you chase after riches and when you chase after pleasure and you're no longer chasing after God, you are rotten. That's what he says right here. Your riches are corrupt. He says your garments are moth-eaten. In other words, they are worthless. Now, you and I, we recognize and we understand that the things that exist in this life are not permanent. But are riches permanent? How many of you have clothes that you wore 50 years ago? There's people doing math in their brains over here, and that is... How much do your clothes survive? They don't. I want you to think about riches for just a minute. And I want to pose a scenario in front of you that you won't care for, and I don't care for it when I pose it about me, but 100 years after our death, where will your riches be? Do you get the point? They're not going to be with you. They're not going to be with me. Even now in this life, how easy is it for you to lose your riches? Very easy. And many times, we, like those in the times of James, we put all of our ideas, we put all of our trust in riches, in looks, in outward appearances, and we miss what's going on. But remember, he's telling these people, he says, your riches, they're rotten, your garments, they're destroying you. But remember, these people probably, just like you and I'm not the ultra rich. I don't live like that. Notice verse 3. Watch what happens. He says, your gold and silver are corrupted. Their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. I want to ask you a question. Who is he writing to here in James 5, 1 through 6, specifically verse 3? Who's he writing to? Well, his original readers, and by extension, you and I. Here's why I know that. Number one, we notice right here in verse 3, it is going to be a witness against who? Not the ultra-rich, because otherwise he would have said them. It's going to be a witness against you, the intended reader. By extension, it has application to you and I, the intended readers. So in verse 1 and 2, they were probably saying like you and I would do, well, that's not how we live. We wouldn't let this happen to us, but let me ask you the question, can it happen to us that riches become the only priority? It can. And that's what he's fighting about here in James chapter 5. In James chapter 4, he was telling you, don't make your plans. He says, don't forget to make your plans with God. In James chapter 5, he says, don't let your plans outrun God. So he illustrates it this way. He says, your gold and silver are corroded. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have a bar of gold sitting at the house, do you? If you do, where do you keep it? But let me ask you this. How valuable is gold? It's kind of the standard, isn't it? It's supposed to be what our money system is backed by. Now, I know we could sit here all day and argue whether our dollar is backed by gold anymore or not, but here's the idea. Gold is valuable. And from the time that James was writing to now, even way back past James, what has been the center of funds? Gold and silver. But how many of us like when our gold and silver becomes corroded? We don't like the idea of finances becoming wasted. We don't like the idea of money no longer being valuable. And he's giving us this idea, the things you put your trust in, they will destroy your heart. Keep your heart in mind in just a moment. He says this, and their corrosion will be a witness against you. I want to put a scene before your minds. You received a summons. It was delivered to you by a law enforcement officer. Your name was on the paper. And you were told that you have been summoned to a trial. When you get to that trial, there are individuals in the rooms, of course, lawyers and others, and a judge, and there are people listening to what you are going to say. How valuable is what you say to the situation that's at hand? Well, if you're the only witness, it's extremely valuable because why? You have the knowledge that determines the outcome. In this scene, he kind of sets a courtroom scene for you and I. He says, this corrosion, it is a witness against who? You and I. What's the corrosion? It's not the fact that gold can corrode or silver can corrode because it is a precious metal and it can corrode. What's the corrosion here? It's corrosion of the heart. Remember chapter 4, don't forget to make your plans with God. Chapter 5, don't let your plans outrun God. And in this occasion, he says this corrosion that is in your heart is the problem. He says not only will it be a witness against you, in other words, what you and I do really tells a story. He says it will eat your flesh like fire. I'm going to give you 3 illustrations about heat. When you go home tonight, turn your stove on and put your hand on that eye. Who's going to do that tonight? Not a one of you. Now, don't go home and do that. I'm not taking the blame for you. Go home tonight. If you have a fireplace that's fueled with gas, turn it on. Put your hand in that flame and see how hot that fire is. Now, don't do that. Don't go home and do that. Go home and take that iron, plug it in the wall, put water in the top of it, and wait till it gets hot. Lay your hand down, take that iron, and just shh. Now, don't do that. If I get a call tonight, when y'all did that, I'm going to say they're the craziest people I know. Now, why would you not put your hand on the stove eye? Why won't you put your hand on the stove eye? Does anybody know? Pain, but it's deeper than pain. Why won't you put your hand in the fireplace? Why won't you take that iron and why won't you do that? Because you know better, right? You know better. And that is what he's illustrating to you and I tonight. These things that we war after, these things that we fight after, these things that we try to follow and try to say they're the most important in this life, he says, you and I, we know better. Just like the man just a moment ago in Acts 24:25, he had heard about the righteousness of God, about salvation that God had offered, but what did he choose? He chose for them to come again another day. Go away. I'll call you when it's convenient for me. Ladies and gentlemen, there's something we need to know. We live in the world of convenience. If you don't believe me, go right up to the front of this building and turn one of those thermostats up or down depending on how you feel and watch what happens. If you're cold, the heat will come on. If you're hot, you press the right button, the air will come on. We live in the world of convenience. If you don't believe me, find a sink in this building and just do this. Or, what happens? Instant gratification comes out, doesn't it? If it were dark in this room, what would you do? You would walk over to the light switch. There's one right there's one right there, and there's about 5 back there. What happens when you flip those switches? Instantly something happens. We live in a world that's about convenience. Don't believe me? Go to the convenience store and pay about twice what you should pay somewhere else. Why do we have convenience stores? Because we live in an instant society. He says if you chase after riches, you chase after pleasure, and we'll see pleasure here in just a moment because he's going to use that exact word inside of his text. He says if you chase after these things, it will eat your flesh like a fire. And ladies and gentlemen, you and I know better. We know better than to put that hand on that stove because we know that pain is coming. We know better than to take that iron and put it on that hand because we know that pain is coming or put that hand down in that fire. We know better. Now let me ask you this. Do we always act like what we know? Sometimes we don't. And thus, in the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5, he's giving us these 2 knocks on the head, and he's saying, pay attention to what's going on. But notice the last part of the verse. He says, you have heaped up treasure in the last days. Now, this phrase, last days, is really interesting to me, and specifically, the last days. There's something specific about these days. What are these last days? We're living in them. Okay, what are they? The Christian age. Okay, there we go. Now, how many of you today have said, in the last days? We don't use that language, do we? We don't use the phrase time in the last time, or we don't use this word. It's a fancy word. I haven't used it since 10 o'clock, and I don't think I had used it in weeks before then. We're living in the last dispensation of time. That's what he's talking about right here. Something intent. He says, you're in the last days, but what does he say? You've laid up treasures or heaped up treasures in the last days. Question. James 1 or James 5, 1, 2, and 3. What treasures were they heaping? Were they heavenly or earthly? Earthly. Because they were seeking after things that would destroy. That's why you can go read passages inside the New Testament that talk about this very idea, such as Matthew 6, 19 through 21. Lay up for yourselves treasures where? In heaven, where what? Moth nor rust, corrosion does not corrupt. In other words, he's telling us where we are focused is where we are going to be. Are we earthly focused? Or are we spiritually focused, eternity focused? He says you've got to make a decision. You've got to have an answer. Now notice what he does as he enters us into verse 4. He said, indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and their cries, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. Here's where it gets real, verse 4. Who owns the fields? Who's he writing to, by the way? To those Christians. He wasn't writing to the ultra-rich unless they were there among the congregation. He was writing to people that were just like you and just like me. They had what they needed, some of which didn't, both physically and spiritually. And he says, some of you, he says, indeed, let's make this real. He says, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields. He says, the people that worked, and they worked in your fields. He says, you're the one that have done this, which you have kept back. Now notice this, by what? Fraud. I want to connect a word to this to give you the idea. By corruption. Corruption. Fraud is an interesting word, but it's very much connected here in this connotation to corruption. Some idea entered their mind, and what the laborer was owed, they didn't give it to them. Is the laborer worthy of his hire? Answer is yes. Is the man who works in the field worthy of the payment you told him he should have gotten? The answer is yes. What's he telling us? Don't defraud one another. Now, interestingly enough, here's where I want us to press the pause button. Sometimes, James 5, 1 through 6, the only thing we can think about is money. Is money. But remember how we started tonight? Are you rich spiritually and are you rich physically? Now, in this occasion, James 5, 1 through 6, especially verse 4, it could be true that you and I defraud one another or defraud someone else of the monies or riches of which they are due. But for just a moment, I want you to think about it in a spiritual connotation. How could you and I defraud someone spiritually? Now, that's probably not the question you came tonight to figure out. But is it possible for us to defraud someone spiritually? If so, how do we do that? Anybody got an idea? Okay, there we go. It can be a failure. By the way, a failure is still a choice, isn't it? If you know it's your responsibility to do it and you don't do it, what did you choose? To not do it. You and I can defraud someone of hearing the gospel. Now, there's something I want to connect to the phrase gospel. The soul-saving gospel. That which brings about, not by our works, but the works of which God has done, all of those spiritual blessings. Number one, we could not tell someone or share with someone. How else could we defraud someone spiritually? Anybody got an idea? I'm going to give you one that's big. Example. Now, here's something I know that's true. I know that we're not all at 100% every day. Isn't that true? You ever had a bad day? You ever had a bad day? Oh, every one of us had a bad day. And have you ever on a bad day said something you normally would have not said or done something you would have normally not done? That's not the day I'm talking about, okay? Because here's what I know. Even preachers have bad days. You have bad days. I understand that. Now, that does not excuse any sinful behavior. That doesn't excuse a bad example, but I'm saying we can make that right, and that's not the normal. But what is your normal? That's the question we have to ask. And we might be defrauding someone based upon our normal. Here's the big question for you. Do you have a church life and a work life? Do you have a church life and a home life? Do you have a church life and a marriage life? Do you have a church life and a parenting life? All of those areas, are you different or are you the same? And there you get the idea. We might defraud someone by putting on that good face on Wednesday nights. But Thursday morning, I'm going to get what's mine. Wednesday night, when no one else is around to see, I'm going to get what's mine. We can defraud individuals spiritually by not sharing as we should and not being the example. Now, I know we could probably go on a while longer of ways we can defraud one another. Let me give you another one. This is the third one that's in my head. And unless you have one, we'll move on. You know how we can defraud someone spiritually? By lying. Now, I don't think you would intend to set out to lie, but let me ask you this. How do you come up with Bible answers to Bible questions? Y'all know the secret to Bible answers to Bible questions? The Bible. Isn't that funny? Yeah. And what happens when we don't give a Bible answer to Bible questions? We misreport the truth. We lie. So there are many ways we might defraud someone, but in this particular occasion, he says that you owed them something and they cried out. What does it mean to cry out? Matter of fact, we read this twice, the cries of the reapers. What does it mean to cry out when some egregious takes place? Okay, say that again. Exposing. When something is due to you and you might say this phrase, that's not right, when it didn't happen. But I want you to notice something about this exposure. And I don't know that I'd call it complaining, because when you're owed something, you're owed something. When you go to work, do you expect a paycheck? You sure do, because you've made an agreement with that employer for X amount of pay for X amount of hours, or however that scale works for you. You've made an agreement. And when it doesn't happen, there are cries that cry out. Now, in this occasion, these cries are heard by someone. Who are these cries heard by? The Lord of the Sabbath. Now, you'll only find this right here in the book of James, in James 5:4, but also in Romans 9, as well as about 258 occasions inside of the Old Testament. 282, I was close. 282 times in the Old Testament, and it primarily refers to the Lord Almighty. So when someone is defrauded, who hears about it? God Himself hears about it. So there's something I want you to see, this Lord of the Sabbath. Who is hearing these things? God is. So I want to build something into your minds tonight that you and I really need to put into tomorrow. When we defraud someone, when we wrong someone, when we sin towards someone, who knows? The Lord knows, doesn't He? Who knows? It's not just the one who was owed, the one who had been fraudulently treated, but who knows? The Lord Almighty knows. The language of this verse doesn't just indicate that He knows, but it's as if you have done it to Him. You'll remember Jesus. If you do it to one of these, or the least, you've done it unto who? Jesus said, unto me. So in this occasion, He's trying to build this case of how we live and what we do. And notice what He says in verse 5. He says, you've lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Kind of an unusual verse, but hear me out here. You've lived on the earth. Where else do we live? Okay. Right now, you and I live on the earth. Where will we live one day? Eternity. Right now, where are we living? You and I, as we are living and breathing right now in this room, we are living on the earth. But my question to you is, how are we living? Are you only concerned about pleasure? And are you only concerned about luxury? Now, we understand the word luxury. We know if something is nice or not. But this word pleasure indicates a whole other realm that these individuals were living in. This word pleasure is connected to not only things that one would enjoy, but it's connected to things that one would desire. And what he's saying here is that you, those who have what you need, those who live lives of riches, he says you have everything you want, and if you don't have it, if you'll allow me to modernize it this way, Amazon will send it to you in 2 days, or the shipping's on them, even though they don't do that anymore. Instant gratification in this life. He says if that's what you're seeking after, you are corrupted. And he says what you're doing is you have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. Now that's a weird phrase to you and I, but he says you've stored up all these riches, you've stored up all these pleasures for who? For self. Now, fast track into verse 6. He says you have condemned, you have murdered. Notice who you've murdered, the just. And he says, he does not resist you. Now, there's 2 ways I want you to think about this passage. Number 1, there's a simplistic view. Those who live these great lives will do anything to get it. Now, that's not what I believe this passage is referring to. But many people will take the simplistic look at James chapter 5, verse 6, and talk about verse 1, those who are rich. Those who live after luxury and pleasure and how they do anything to get it. I don't think that's what it means. Because I want you to look at the last part of the verse, and then we'll go back up to the front part of the verse and figure it out. He says, he who does not resist you. Also, I want you to know something else. The just in the Greek language is in singular case. In other words, this one that is just, there's only one. Who is the only just one? Christ. Do we all agree to that? I think we all agree that Christ is the only just one. But he does not resist you. And you have condemned. Well, to pull all this together, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back a couple of verses back to the beginning. Come now, you who are rich. How we started this was, before we ever got to verse 3, was they probably thought, that's not me. But verse 3 and verse 4 says, it's you. So remember, just walk through this with me again and just see it as we go through it. He says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Who needed to weep and howl? Who needed to weep and howl? It wasn't the ultra rich, even though they needed to as well, but who was it? God's people need to weep, and God's people need to howl if they outrun God. Can you think of an individual who outran God in the Old Testament? Jonah tried. Okay, there we go. I'm glad you used that word. Jonah tried. You remember Jonah was told to go to a city and to preach to that great city. He said, that's why I'm sending you. So what does Jonah do? Jonah starts. But did Jonah want to go to Nineveh, that great city? He did not. So what did Jonah do? Well, he went somewhere else. He bought a ticket. He funded his own travels. And he went somewhere else. He outran God's plan. He overshadowed God's plan. He circumvented God's plan to go somewhere else. Look at verse 1. Come now, you rich. How does James talk to these people? He says, you're rich and you don't even know how good you've got it. I would suggest to you that he's talking about physical riches, but he's talking about spiritual riches. He says you need to weep, you need to howl. He says you need to recognize what's coming on you if you stay on this course. If you stay on this course. You roll into verse 2. He says your riches are corrupted. It will destroy you. You roll into verse 3. He says your gold and silver, it's corroded. It's corrupted again. It's this constant cycle of this mindset, this heart that is no longer focused on God and is only focused on what I can get. Not just about planning with God, but about outrunning God. Now, let me ask you this of Jonah. Jonah finds himself on a boat. What happens to Jonah? Does it work out for Jonah the way Jonah thought it was going to work out? What happens to Jonah? There was this great tempest. They ended up throwing him overboard. What happens to Jonah in the sea? He's swallowed by a big animal, big fish. But I want to remind you something about Jonah. When Jonah was in the depths of the sea, what did Jonah do? What did Jonah do? Jonah prayed. Because Jonah recognized his condition. Do you know what he's telling us here in verses 1 through 6? He says, pay attention to where you're at in this life. But I want you to be brought back to a phrase, in the last days. These treasures that they were heaping up, they were heaping them up now. There's no more dispensation of time. After time has ceased, how much time will be left? Only eternity. No more time for do-overs, you and I might say. And he tells them in verse 4, God hears and knows and sees every person you defraud. Whether we talk about it in a physical sense or we talk about it in a spiritual sense. And I contend with you tonight that we need to focus on this in a spiritual sense. Because here's something that's true about most people that live around or near you. They're rich. Compared to the world, they are. But I want to ask you this. Spiritually speaking, how rich is a person that's lost? And that changes the way we look at our world. If we defraud those who are lost, they may not cry out. But are they still lost? Now, if we defraud those physically, they may cry out, and woe on us, shame on us if that's what happens. And then back in verse 5, he says, you've got everything you want. You keep building your lives, you keep sustaining your life, you have everything that you want, yet you're trying to take from someone else. Rolls back into verse 6. You have condemned, you have murdered the just, he does not resist you. Now, I don't think they literally were condemning the public. I don't think they literally were murdering good people. But they were living against Christ. And that was the problem. He says, you've condemned. What ways, or what have they condemned? The righteous ways. You see, one of two things exist. Matter of fact, this was brought up in class this morning at 10 o'clock, so let's kind of go down this road. How do we know whether we support God or not? How do we know whether we support God or not? Okay, there's a good one, okay. By the way we attend worship services. Does everyone in the room agree that worship services are important? Bible classes? I think we all do. Okay, hold that in your mind. How do we support God? How do we show our faith? Is it just attending services? Oh, yeah, it's much deeper than that. Okay, there's a good one. How you treat your neighbor. Makes me think about the previous verse. You have indeed fraudulently treated those who mowed your fields. So it's how we treat one another. But is living the Christian life just about going to church and treating people right? Is that what it's all about? Is that the only two things we need to be concerned about? No. So how do we show support unto the Lord? Well, it's each and every day, isn't it? And all throughout life, there are these little tests that come up. Now, I asked the question at 10 o'clock, how are we tested in this life? Let me ask you tonight, is there a test coming up that you're getting ready to face? I agree with that. But sometimes there are events in our lives, events in our world that may cause us to determine our allegiance unto God. Is there one coming up? Does anybody know what it is? Okay. Let's talk about the Super Bowl for just a minute. Is there anything wrong with the Super Bowl? What'd you say? I heard you, but I didn't hear you. Okay. All right. But listen to this question again. Is there anything wrong with the Super Bowl? No. I agree with you. I prefer to just not have a halftime show. And if you come Sunday night after services, we're going to pause the television during that. We've got something in plan. You will love it. I ain't telling you anything else. Is there anything wrong with the Super Bowl? No, there's nothing wrong with sporting events. But let me ask you this question. Is there anything wrong with putting these things above God? There's your problem. And by the way, these riches that we're talking about, where did they have to be put for them to become the number one priority? They had to be put above God. All throughout life, we face little tests. I call them little tests because sometimes we ignore how big they could be. And we ignore how important they could be. But there are a number of things. It's not just the Super Bowl that take us away from God. That's what he's teaching us here in these 6 verses. And he says at the end of this, and by the way, there could be something else coming up this weekend that's not the Super Bowl that could cause you to stray away from God. It's not just sporting events that do that, but it just so happens we hit James chapter 5 at the right time because there's one coming up. And the world's going to pay attention to it, aren't they? Matter of fact, here's how we know how valuable the Super Bowl is to our society. Do you know how much a 30-second commercial is going to cost this year? One 30-second commercial. Do you know how much it's going to cost? $7 million for 30 seconds. About 10 years ago, it was about $750,000. Now it's $7 million. So you watch those 7 million 30 seconds. And you add that up. I don't know how many commercials are going to be in the prime time zone of the Super Bowl, but it's not just one, is it? I wonder how much this place is going to cost in the grand scheme. Do you see what I'm talking about? These things come back to a root. It's riches. These companies know if we invest $7 million in these 30 seconds, it's going to pay us back, and it will. Those advertisements will pay them back. Otherwise, they wouldn't pay them. How many of you pay bills or invest in things that aren't going to pay you back? You know you're going to lose the money. You don't do that. You invest in something that's going to pay you back. So here's the idea. There's the thought. In this, how do we condemn Christ? How do we murder the just one? How do we do that? When things are more valuable than him. You've condemned him. Why? Because he's no longer worthy of your time. You have murdered the just one. Why? It's like crucifying him all again because he's not just valuable enough for you. But notice the last part. He does not resist you. Is God going to stop you from being rich? Is God going to stop you from walking away from him? Is God going to stop you from trying to harm him? By the way, just as much as is God going to stop you from doing good? What is God going to give you? He's going to give you opportunity. And before every one of us in the physical realm and in the spiritual realm, we stand tomorrow, we even stand in today with opportunity. We've got to decide what we're going to do with those opportunities. Now, I want you to see something. I want to talk about next week's class. And I want to show you a word. In James 5:7, the first word is, therefore. Come back next week. We will find out how to make God a priority number one in our lives. But not only that, we're going to learn how we can strengthen the church. Let me ask you this question, and it'll be the last question I ask, and class will be over. Do we need to strengthen the church? Don't you think so? I think so. And shouldn't that not be a priority in our lives? Well, we'll get there next week. And then after that, we'll have one more class in the book of James. And then after that, we'll be done with our study of the book of James. And we'll enter into a study of the book of Colossians. I appreciate your comments and your time.